Widow's Love tells the story of Grace Turner, a 45-year-old widow who, after losing her beloved husband Michael, finds herself navigating the emotional turmoil of grief and loneliness. Just when she thinks she'll never love again, she meets Ethan Brooks, a kind and patient man who makes her question everything she thought she knew about love. As Grace struggles with feelings of guilt for considering a new relationship, she must also confront the memories of her late husband and the life they built together. Can she open her heart again, or will she forever be bound by the past? With the support of her best friend, Sarah, and the encouragement of her daughter Lily, Grace embarks on a journey of self-discovery, learning that love is not about forgetting the past but embracing the future. The story explores themes of love, loss, healing, and the courage to begin anew, all set against the backdrop of a woman's emotional evolution after the loss of her partner. Grace Turner sat in her favorite armchair by the window, the faint light of the late afternoon spilling over the worn pages of a book she had long since lost interest in. Her fingers traced the edges of the cover, her mind elsewhere. The house was still, eerily so, without the steady hum of life that once filled it. The silence had become her companion, one she had never chosen but could not escape. The wind gently rustled the leaves outside, reminding her of those days when Michael had been there beside her, laughing at her habit of always reading in the same spot. He had always teased her about how she could never sit anywhere else, no matter how many new pieces of furniture they bought, no matter how many rooms they renovated. It was hard to imagine how they had arrived at this moment, the quiet that stretched endlessly before her. She had known it was coming, had prepared herself for the inevitable, but nothing had truly prepared her for the empty house. Nothing had prepared her for the stillness that settled in her chest when she opened her eyes each morning, realizing Michael was gone. Grace's mind drifted back to the last few months of Michael's life, the final days she had tried so desperately to make bearable. She could still remember the harsh scent of the hospital, the sterile, oppressive air that seemed to settle in her lungs whenever she walked through those automatic doors. The endless days spent watching him slip away, the tubes, the machines, the sterile rooms where life and death blurred together. But what she remembered most was the quiet strength in his eyes when he looked at her. Even in his final moments, Michael had never complained. He had never spoken of his suffering, had never let her see the cracks in the facade he put up for her. She had always admired him for that, for his stoic nature, for his fierce love. "Grace," Michael had whispered just days before he passed. His voice was weak, but his hand, still warm, had reached out to hers. Promise me you'll live." At that moment, Grace had promised him, though she wasn't sure how she could ever keep such a promise. How could she live without him? How could she go on when every inch of her life was so deeply entwined with the man she had loved for so long? The days after his death had been a blur. The funeral, the condolences, the well-meaning visitors who came to offer their support, all of it felt like an imposition on the grief that clung to her. She had wanted nothing more than to retreat, to crawl into a hole and disappear. But life, with its endless demands, wouldn't let her. Grace closed her eyes, leaning her head back against the chair, and let herself sink into the memory of Michael's warm embrace. She could almost feel the touch of his hand, the reassuring weight of his presence beside her. Those days when their biggest problem had been deciding what to have for dinner, those days when they had spent hours talking about everything and nothing, seemed like a lifetime ago. Suddenly, the sound of a knock at the door broke the stillness. Grace blinked, startled. She had forgotten what it felt like to have someone visit. Slowly, she rose to her feet, her joints stiff from the long hours spent in the chair, and walked to the door. She didn't know who it could be, perhaps one of Michael's old colleagues, or maybe a neighbor checking in. When she opened the door, she was met with the last person she had expected, Ethan Brooks. "Hi," he said softly, a slight smile on his face. He looked just as she remembered, kind, with a warmth in his eyes that immediately put her at ease, but with an unspoken sadness about him, a depth that only someone who had been through loss could understand. Grace stood frozen for a moment, unsure of how to respond. She hadn't seen Ethan in years. They had met at a school reunion a few months ago, and while their conversations had been pleasant, they had drifted apart after the event. She hadn't expected him to show up on her doorstep, certainly not now, when everything felt so raw. "Ethan?" she asked, her voice unsteady. What brings you here?" He cleared his throat and took a step closer, his gaze gentle. "I was just in the neighborhood," he said, his voice low. "I thought I'd stop by. I know it's been a while, but I wanted to check in. How are you?" The question caught her off guard. She hadn't even thought about how to answer it, hadn't considered how anyone could ask her that without making it sound hollow. I'm getting by, Grace replied, offering him a tentative smile. It's just hard, you know? Every day is the same. I'm still trying to figure out how to live without him. Ethan nodded, his eyes softening. I understand. I know that feeling all too well. Grace felt an unexpected rush of gratitude. She had never expected Ethan to truly understand what she was going through, but there was something in his expression, something in his voice, that made her feel seen. Not like the others, who had shown up with their condolences but never seemed to know what to say when the reality of her grief lingered long after the funeral. Ethan shifted on his feet, as though uncertain whether to stay or leave. He seemed to be searching for the right words, but none came. The silence between them stretched for a long moment before he spoke again. If you ever need someone to talk to, he said gently, I'm here. No pressure, but I know how isolating this time can be. Sometimes it helps to have someone listen. Grace wasn't sure what to say. Part of her wanted to slam the door, retreat into her solitude and never let anyone in again. But another part of her, one that she hadn't acknowledged in a long time, felt a flicker of something else. A curiosity. A longing. The possibility of a connection. I appreciate that, Ethan, she said, her voice small. I don't think I'm ready to talk about everything just yet, but I'll keep it in mind. Ethan nodded, his smile understanding. I'll be around, Grace. Just don't hesitate if you change your mind. With that, he gave her one last, soft smile before turning and walking away. Grace stood in the doorway for a moment, watching him go. The air around her felt strangely lighter, as though, for the first time in a long while, the weight of grief had lifted, if only just a little. As the door clicked shut behind her, Grace leaned against it and let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. For the first time since Michael had died, she felt something that wasn't pain or sadness. She felt a glimmer of hope. Grace sat at the kitchen table, the empty coffee cup before her growing cold. The early morning light streamed through the window, casting long shadows across the wooden floor. She had never been much of a morning person, but since Michael's death, it seemed the mornings came too quickly. It was as though time had sped up, or perhaps she had simply slowed down. She glanced at the clock on the wall. It was nearly noon, and she had barely moved since Ethan left. She wasn't sure what had possessed her to open the door to him. Perhaps it was loneliness. Or perhaps it was because, for a fleeting moment, she had caught a glimpse of what life might be like if she could allow herself to feel something other than sorrow. But as quickly as that thought had surfaced, the weight of her guilt descended again. How could she even consider moving forward? How could she open her heart to anyone else when Michael's presence was still so vividly etched in every corner of this house? Grace's hand hovered over the coffee cup, but she couldn't bring herself to take another sip. She had lost count of the number of mornings she had sat here like this, staring into nothingness, the weight of memories heavy on her chest. Memories of Michael. It was impossible to escape them. She could still feel his touch, the warmth of his hand in hers when they would sit on the couch, talking about everything and nothing. His laughter, deep and rich, echoing through the house. Their shared moments, cooking dinner together, long walks in the park, lazy Sundays spent reading books and watching old movies, had filled the house with life. Now, the silence was suffocating. The echoes of those moments played in her mind, louder than the emptiness around her. But then there was Ethan. The thought of him surprised her. Why couldn't she stop thinking about him? It wasn't love, not yet. But the brief moment of connection they'd shared felt different than anything she had felt in years. He had listened. He had truly listened, without judgment, without pushing her to be something she wasn't. It wasn't something Grace had realized she needed, but now, in the quiet aftermath of their conversation, it was something she craved. She sighed and pushed the cup aside. Standing up, she walked over to the window and gazed out at the garden. Michael had planted the roses, her favorite, just before his illness took a turn for the worse. She had often told him how beautiful the flowers would be in spring. He had smiled weakly, never thinking he wouldn't be there to see them bloom. She had promised him she'd take care of the roses. And she had. It was all she could do, really, keep her promises to him. But now, as the roses began to bloom in brilliant red and pink, she couldn't help but feel like she was betraying him. How could she move forward when every single thing around her screamed of the life they had shared? The sound of a car pulling into the driveway startled Grace. She turned toward the window, her heart skipping a beat when she saw Ethan's car parked outside. She hadn't expected him to return. What was he doing here? He was getting out of the car, holding a small potted plant in his hands. For a moment, Grace felt a knot form in her stomach. Why had he come back? She hadn't asked for his company, hadn't invited him into her life. The doorbell rang, and she froze. For a moment, she considered not answering. But before she could talk herself out of it, she found herself walking toward the door. Her heart was pounding, and her hands felt clammy as she reached for the handle. When she opened the door, Ethan was standing there, a gentle smile on his face. "I thought I'd bring you something," he said, holding out the potted plant. It was a small lavender plant, the pale purple flowers just beginning to bloom. "I remember you mentioning that you like lavender, and I thought it might brighten the place up a bit." Grace blinked, taken aback by the gesture. She hadn't expected him to come back, let alone bring a gift. Thank you," she said, her voice soft and hesitant. "It's beautiful." Ethan's smile widened slightly, but his eyes were still kind, searching for something. Maybe for her to let him in, to let him be there for her in a way that she wasn't sure she was ready for. "I know it's not much," he continued, his tone warm but unsure, "but I thought maybe it could help. You mentioned you didn't have much to do with the garden lately, and, well, I just thought it might be nice." Grace felt a lump form in her throat. It was such a small, thoughtful gesture, and yet it felt like more than she could bear. She looked down at the lavender plant in her hands and then back up at Ethan, unsure of what to say. "You don't have to do this," Grace said, her voice barely above a whisper. I'm not ready to move on, Ethan. I'm not ready to forget Michael." Ethan's expression softened, and he nodded slowly, his eyes never leaving hers. "I'm not asking you to forget him, Grace. I would never ask you to do that. I just want to be here for you, in whatever way you need." The sincerity in his words caught her off guard. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't pushing her to feel something she wasn't ready to feel. He was just there, standing before her, offering her a moment of kindness in the midst of her pain. "I know you're still grieving, and that's okay," Ethan added gently. "You don't have to figure it all out right now. I just wanted you to know that I'm here." Grace swallowed hard, her emotions threatening to spill over. What was this? Why was he being so kind, so patient? The truth was, she had no answers. She didn't know how to handle the emotions swirling inside her, guilt, sadness, longing. She wasn't sure if she was ready to let go of the past, but she wasn't sure she could keep living in it either. "Thank you," she said again, her voice thick with emotion. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," Ethan replied, his voice soothing. "Just know I'm here, Grace. Whenever you're ready." Grace nodded slowly, the weight of her emotions pressing down on her. For the first time in a long while, she felt a flicker of hope, a quiet understanding that maybe, just maybe, there could be more to life than the pain she had been carrying. As Ethan turned to leave, Grace stood there in the doorway, holding the lavender plant close to her chest. The house still felt empty, but in that moment, it didn't feel quite as lonely as it had before. Grace had never been one to invite others into her space. Her home was her sanctuary, the place where she could grieve in silence, where she didn't have to pretend to be okay. But Ethan had broken through that wall. The lavender plant he had brought with him sat on the kitchen counter, a quiet symbol of his visit. It seemed out of place in the otherwise somber room, but in a way, it was a reminder that life still had color, even in the darkest of times. For days, Grace couldn't stop thinking about him. Why did Ethan's kindness linger so long in her mind? It was just a plant, just a gesture, but there was something about the way he had looked at her. Something in his eyes that made her feel understood, seen in a way she hadn't been in years. And yet, the guilt gnawed at her. How could she think about moving on? How could she even entertain the idea of another relationship when Michael's absence was still so sharp, so raw? That night, after she had finished her dinner, she sat down with a glass of wine. The house was quiet again, too quiet. The faint sound of wind outside was the only noise that filled the space. Grace glanced at the clock. It was just after 8 p.m. The time she would have spent with Michael was no more, and the emptiness of those hours stretched before her like a chasm she didn't know how to cross. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. She froze for a moment, unsure of whether to answer. Who could it be? She hadn't expected anyone, not at this hour. The memory of Ethan's last visit flashed in her mind, his gentle voice, his kindness. Was he back again? Grace set the wine glass down on the table and made her way to the door, each step hesitant. When she opened it, she was surprised to find Ethan standing there once again, this time with a bottle of red wine in his hand and a hesitant look on his face. "I hope I'm not disturbing you," he said, holding the bottle up slightly, as if to explain himself. "I thought maybe, if you're not busy, we could share a drink. I know it's not much, but I thought it might be nice." Grace stared at him for a moment, her heart suddenly pounding. Why was he here again? Was he offering more than just a drink? "Sure," she said, her voice steady but unsure. She stepped aside to let him in. "Come in." Ethan walked in slowly, setting the wine bottle on the counter. He glanced around the room, taking in the quiet, the stillness. Grace wondered if he saw the weight of her grief hanging in the air, if he felt the heaviness of the house. She hadn't bothered to hide it, but she also hadn't expected anyone to notice. "I didn't think you'd want to drink alone," Ethan said, his voice soft. "I thought maybe we could have a glass talk, if you're up for it." Grace nodded, though her mind was a swirl of thoughts. She wasn't sure what to say or what he expected. Was this a casual visit? Or was it something else? He poured the wine into 2 glasses and handed one to her. They clinked their glasses together, the sound so foreign in the quiet house. For a moment, they both sipped in silence. Grace studied him as she took a sip, noticing the lines on his face, lines that spoke of his own hardships, his own history. He wasn't perfect, and neither was she. But in his eyes, she saw an understanding that she hadn't seen in anyone else since Michael. The silence between them grew heavier, but this time, it felt different. It wasn't uncomfortable, but there was an unspoken tension, a knowing that something more was waiting to be said. Finally, Grace broke the silence. "Why do you keep coming back?" The question hung between them, simple yet loaded. She hadn't meant to say it out loud, but it was on her mind, demanding to be addressed. Ethan looked at her with a long, searching gaze, as if weighing his words carefully. He set his glass down and leaned forward slightly. "Because I want to be here for you, Grace. I know you've been through a lot, and I know it's not easy, but," he paused, as though struggling to find the right words. "I don't think you should have to go through this alone. And I think I could help. I just want to be there, however you need." Grace swallowed hard, the knot in her chest tightening. She hadn't expected him to say something so direct, so vulnerable. Was he being sincere? Or was this just a kind gesture from a man who didn't know how to step back once he'd started? She shook her head, her voice cracking slightly. "I can't just let go of him, Ethan. Michael was everything to me. He still is." She paused, feeling the weight of those words. "And I feel guilty even thinking about moving on. I feel like I'm betraying him somehow." Ethan's face softened, his expression gentle, but his eyes were full of understanding. "Grace, no one is asking you to forget Michael. You can love him and still live your life. You can still honor his memory while opening yourself up to new possibilities. It's not about replacing him, or erasing what you had. It's about learning to live with the love and the loss." Grace closed her eyes, letting his words sink in. Could she really live with both? It was a thought that had never occurred to her, not in the way Ethan said it, at least. She had thought that to move forward meant she would have to leave Michael behind, that to open her heart to someone else would mean betraying the love they had shared. But now, listening to Ethan, she realized that maybe it wasn't that simple. Maybe there could be space in her heart for both love and loss. Maybe she didn't have to choose between Michael and herself. For the first time in a long while, Grace felt a glimmer of hope. "I don't know if I'm ready, Ethan," she whispered, her voice trembling slightly. "But I think I need time. And I'm not sure what that looks like yet." Ethan reached out, gently placing his hand on hers. The contact was warm, reassuring, and for a brief moment, Grace allowed herself to lean into it. "That's all I'm asking," he said softly. "Take all the time you need. I'll be here." And just like that, the weight on Grace's chest seemed to lighten, even if just for a moment. She hadn't realized how much she needed someone to be there, someone who didn't expect her to have everything figured out. As they sat together, the room no longer felt as empty as it had before. The quiet was still there, but it wasn't suffocating anymore. It was simply space. Space to breathe. Space to heal. And maybe, just maybe, space to find love again. The days had become a blur of quiet afternoons and restless nights. Grace had found herself waking up each morning, staring at the same walls that had witnessed the most intimate moments of her life with Michael. The photographs, the knickknacks they'd collected over the years, the scent of coffee still lingering in the air from the night before, all of it felt like an anchor, holding her in place, yet suffocating her at the same time. The lavender plant that Ethan had brought remained on the kitchen counter, a symbol of his kindness, yet every time Grace looked at it, she was reminded of her internal conflict. Was it wrong to let someone else in? The guilt crept in like an unwanted visitor, but it was quickly followed by something else, a flicker of possibility, a spark of hope she hadn't allowed herself to feel for so long. Ethan had called once more, inviting her out for coffee. He was patient, understanding, but there was a subtle pressure in his voice that Grace couldn't ignore. It wasn't demanding, no, far from it. It was simply the quiet encouragement of a man who wanted to be a part of her life, to share in the moments she had yet to reclaim for herself. She had hesitated, almost saying no several times, but somehow, that small voice in her head pushed her to say yes. And so, now she was standing in front of the mirror, brushing her hair, trying to decide if this was something she was ready for. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, a woman who had lost so much, yet was now on the cusp of something she hadn't anticipated. Was she really ready to put herself out there again? With a sigh, Grace let the brush fall from her hand and made her way to the door. One step at a time, she reminded herself. The small coffee shop was warm, inviting, with the rich aroma of roasted beans and the soft hum of conversation. It was the kind of place that felt like a sanctuary for quiet moments, where the world could slow down, if only for a brief while. Ethan was already there, sitting at a corner table, his eyes lighting up when he saw her walk in. He stood up, a smile stretching across his face, as though he had been waiting for her to arrive, not just for the coffee, but for her presence. "Grace," he said warmly, pulling out the chair for her. "I'm glad you could make it." She smiled, though her heart was pounding in her chest. She sat down, taking a deep breath, the nervous energy still palpable between them. "I wasn't sure if I should come," she admitted, looking down at her hands. "I mean, I don't even know why I'm here. I'm not ready for this." Ethan nodded, his expression softening. "You don't have to be ready. No one expects you to be." Grace let out a small, surprised laugh. "And what if I'm never ready?" His gaze was steady, compassionate. "Then that's okay too. But I think you'll be surprised at how strong you are when you give yourself the chance to feel something again." The words hit Grace harder than she anticipated. She hadn't expected him to be so understanding, so accepting of where she was, without rushing her into anything. She had expected to feel pressure, to feel as though she needed to make a decision, to choose between the past and the future. But Ethan wasn't doing that. He was giving her room to breathe. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice shaky. The conversation moved on to lighter topics, books they had read, places they'd been, funny stories from their past. But through it all, Grace couldn't shake the feeling that she was walking on a tightrope. Every laugh felt like a small victory, every moment of connection felt like a risk. As they spoke, Grace found herself remembering what it felt like to laugh without the weight of grief pressing down on her. It was something she hadn't realized she had missed so much, the ability to just enjoy the present without feeling haunted by the past. Ethan wasn't trying to replace Michael, nor did he want to erase the love she had for him. He was simply offering her a way to rediscover joy, and for that, Grace felt both grateful and terrified. The conversation shifted again, this time to something more personal. Ethan hesitated for a moment before speaking. "Grace, I want to ask you something," he said, his tone softer. "And if you don't feel ready, I completely understand. But I need to know, is there a part of you that's still open to the idea of loving again?" Grace felt her chest tighten at the question. It wasn't something she had allowed herself to consider. The thought of being with someone else felt like a betrayal, but the more she thought about it, the more she realized that loving again didn't mean she had to forget Michael. "I don't know," she answered, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I could love anyone the way I loved Michael. And I don't know if that's even fair to you." Ethan leaned back in his chair, watching her carefully. "Grace, no one is asking you to love anyone the same way. I'm not here to replace him. I'm just here to be someone who listens, who's there, who lets you move forward at your own pace. And I think you've been holding yourself back for so long. You deserve more than this pain." The sincerity in his voice left Grace speechless. She wanted to tell him everything, to explain how the thought of moving forward made her feel guilty, how she feared she would never truly be able to let go of the past. But she couldn't. Not yet. Maybe one day, she finally said, her voice trembling. Maybe one day, I'll be ready. But not today. Ethan gave her a small, understanding smile. That's all I can ask for. No pressure, Grace. I'm not going anywhere. The rest of the afternoon passed in a quiet, peaceful rhythm. Grace left the coffee shop with a mixture of emotions swirling inside her, uncertainty, gratitude, and for the first time in a long while, a sense of possibility. As she walked to her car, she felt a weight lift from her shoulders. The day hadn't solved everything, but it had opened a door. It had reminded her that she could still feel something for another person without dishonoring Michael's memory. As she drove home, she glanced in the rearview mirror and saw the lavender plant sitting in the back seat, a small, comforting reminder that life, no matter how difficult, still had room for beauty and hope. And maybe, just maybe, there was still room for love. The days that followed her coffee date with Ethan felt different. Grace found herself awake more often in the middle of the night, staring at the ceiling, her mind racing with thoughts she didn't know how to process. The idea of moving forward, of finding happiness again, was slowly settling in, but so was the fear that she was betraying Michael's memory. How could she ever move on when Michael had been everything? Every day, the same question echoed in her head, an internal battle between the future and the past. Grace spent the next few days in a haze, working through her routines, tending to the garden she and Michael had built together. She had watered the lavender plant Ethan brought, but there was a part of her that still couldn't let go of the guilt she felt for even considering a life beyond the grief. It wasn't that she didn't appreciate Ethan's kindness, she did. It was just that part of her still didn't believe she deserved it, still felt trapped in the sorrow that had become a part of her identity. But Ethan hadn't disappeared. Every few days, he would call or text, asking if she was okay, or if she wanted to grab a coffee or go for a walk. And despite herself, Grace found herself agreeing each time, her hesitation slowly fading. She had started to realize that Ethan wasn't asking for anything in return, he simply wanted to be there. And for the first time since Michael's death, Grace began to look forward to their conversations. This afternoon, after a long day of organizing old photographs, Grace felt the familiar flutter of anticipation when her phone buzzed on the counter. It was a message from Ethan. How about a walk in the park this evening? I thought we could get some fresh air and talk, if you feel up to it. She stared at the message, her finger hovering over the reply button. A part of her wanted to say no. It would be easier to stay at home, to stay in the safe cocoon of solitude where nothing could change. But another part of her, the part that had been slowly awakening, wanted to say yes. Maybe it was time to step out of the shadows of the past and into something new. Grace tapped out a quick response, I'd like that. 6 p.m. Ethan replied almost immediately, perfect. See you then. As the evening approached, Grace found herself in front of the mirror again, staring at her reflection. What was she doing? She couldn't remember the last time she had dressed for anything other than necessity, jeans and a sweater, something comfortable. Today, however, she found herself pulling on a simple sundress she hadn't worn in years. It felt like a strange, unfamiliar decision. She barely recognized the woman who stood before her. But as she stepped outside, the cool evening air brushed against her skin, and for a moment she felt lighter. She didn't know if it was the dress or the anticipation of seeing Ethan, but something shifted inside her. The weight of the past wasn't gone, but it didn't feel as crushing as it had before. When she arrived at the park, Ethan was already there, leaning casually against a tree, his hands shoved into the pockets of his jacket. When he saw her, his face lit up with a genuine smile that made her heart skip a beat. The sight of him stirred something she hadn't expected, a pull, a desire to connect, to move forward. Hey, Ethan greeted her, his voice warm. You look beautiful. Grace smiled, feeling an unexpected flush creep up her neck. Thanks, she said softly, a little surprised by the compliment. I wasn't sure what to wear, but I thought, why not? He nodded, his eyes sparkling. You look like someone who's ready to embrace the world again. She chuckled nervously, glancing down at her feet. I'm still figuring that part out. They started walking, the sound of their footsteps blending with the rustling of leaves in the wind. The park was mostly empty at this hour, the setting sun casting long shadows across the path. Grace appreciated the quiet, the peace that the park seemed to offer. For once, it felt like she could breathe without the weight of grief pressing down on her chest. As they walked side by side, the conversation flowed easily. They spoke about their childhoods, about the places they wanted to visit, about the small joys that had come into their lives since the pandemic. Ethan was easy to talk to, and Grace found herself laughing more than she had in months. It was a laughter that wasn't forced, that didn't carry the burden of sadness. It was real, unguarded. And yet, the underlying tension remained, unspoken but ever-present. Grace knew that Ethan wasn't just interested in friendship. He was offering her more, and she could feel it in the way he looked at her, those fleeting glances, those small touches of his hand brushing against hers as they walked. But she wasn't sure if she was ready to acknowledge it, let alone act on it. They stopped by the pond, the surface shimmering under the last rays of the sun. The silence between them was comfortable now, the weight of the moment lessened by their easy camaraderie. Ethan turned to face her, his expression serious but gentle. "Grace," he said softly, his voice almost a whisper, "I know this might not be easy for you. But I want you to know that I'm not rushing you. I don't expect anything. But if you ever feel like taking a step forward, I'd be honored to be the one you take it with." Grace's heart skipped a beat. She had been expecting this, yet hearing it made the reality of it hit her like a wave. What if she wasn't ready? What if she never would be? She looked into his eyes, searching for something, an answer, a way forward. But all she saw was sincerity. "I don't know if I can love again, Ethan," she said, her voice trembling. "And I'm scared that if I open up to you, I'll be betraying everything I had with Michael." Ethan reached out and gently took her hand, his thumb brushing over her knuckles in a reassuring motion. "You're not betraying anyone, Grace," he said, his voice steady. "You're allowed to live. You're allowed to feel joy again. And I'm here for whatever you decide." Tears welled up in Grace's eyes, and for the first time in so long, she let them fall. She wasn't sure what the future held, but for the first time, the weight of grief didn't feel so heavy. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to live again. "I don't know where this will go," she whispered, "but I'm willing to find out." Ethan smiled, his eyes filled with warmth. "That's all I ask, Grace. That's all I need." And in that moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to appear, Grace allowed herself to hope again. Maybe she could heal. Maybe there was a way to carry the love of her past while still embracing the future. As they walked back to their cars, hand in hand, the path ahead seemed just a little less uncertain. The following weeks passed in a blur of small, intimate moments with Ethan. Grace found herself looking forward to their conversations more than she ever thought she would. What had started as tentative coffee dates and quiet walks turned into longer, more meaningful exchanges. They would meet in the evenings, sometimes for a drink, sometimes for dinner, and they would talk for hours, as if no time had passed at all. Grace had never imagined she could connect with someone like this, so soon after losing Michael. Was it wrong? The question lingered in the back of her mind, but each time she saw Ethan's warm smile, heard his gentle laughter, the uncertainty seemed to fade, just for a moment. He wasn't trying to replace Michael, and she wasn't trying to forget him. Yet somehow, in the presence of Ethan's kindness, she was beginning to rediscover parts of herself she had long since buried. One evening, as they sat at a small bistro, sharing a bottle of wine, the conversation turned toward their pasts. Grace had never really opened up to Ethan about the years she had spent with Michael, how they had met, how they had fallen in love. She had told him bits and pieces, stories of their travels, of their home, but never the depth of their connection, the love that had sustained them for so long. But tonight, as Ethan listened quietly, his eyes full of patience, she found herself beginning to share more. "I met Michael when I was in college," she said, her voice soft, almost reverent. "I wasn't looking for love, not at all. I was focused on my studies, trying to figure out what I wanted in life. But when I saw him, everything just stopped. He was so different from anyone I'd ever met. He was quiet, introspective, but when he smiled, it was like the whole world smiled with him." Ethan listened closely, his gaze never leaving hers. "He had this way of making everything feel right, you know? Even when life was hard, he had this calm about him, this steadiness that I leaned on. We got married a few years after we graduated. I think I knew, even before we said our vows, that he was the one I would spend the rest of my life with." Grace paused, swirling the wine in her glass, lost in the memory. "When he got sick, I thought we'd have more time. I wasn't ready to lose him. But when the doctors said there was nothing else they could do, I was lost. I didn't know who I was without him. Ethan's hand reached across the table, gently covering hers. You don't have to forget him, Grace. I'm not asking you to. Grace smiled, but it was a smile laced with sadness. I know. It's just, sometimes I feel like I'm betraying him. Like I'm dishonoring his memory by letting someone else in. But with you, I don't feel that way. I don't know what it is about you, Ethan, but you make me feel safe. You make me feel like it's okay to live again. Ethan squeezed her hand gently. You're not betraying anyone, Grace. You're learning to live with your grief. You're learning that loving someone again doesn't mean forgetting. It's about carrying both, the past and the present. And I'm here with you for whatever you need. Tears welled up in Grace's eyes. She hadn't realized how much she needed to hear those words, how much she needed to hear someone say that it was okay to feel happiness again, even if she still carried the pain of loss. Ethan wasn't pushing her to be something she wasn't. He wasn't rushing her, wasn't demanding that she move on. He was simply offering her his presence, his understanding, and his patience. For the first time in a long time, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. The guilt she had carried for so long wasn't gone, but it wasn't as suffocating. Maybe, just maybe, she could begin to see a future where love wasn't a betrayal of the past. Later that evening, as they walked through the quiet streets, their footsteps soft on the pavement, Grace found herself lost in thought. She wasn't sure where this was leading, where she and Ethan were heading, but she knew one thing: she had taken another step forward. And that was enough for now. They reached the small park where they had first walked together, and Ethan stopped, turning to face her. Grace, he said softly, I'm not going anywhere. Whenever you're ready, whenever you need me, I'm here. She looked up at him, her heart swelling with emotions she couldn't quite articulate. Could she love again? Could she truly let go of the past, even just a little, and embrace a future with him? The question still lingered, unanswered. But for the first time, Grace didn't feel scared of the possibility. She didn't feel like she was dishonoring Michael. She just felt hopeful. I don't know what tomorrow brings, Ethan, she said, her voice quiet but steady. But I know that for the first time in a long time, I'm not afraid of it. Ethan smiled, his hand resting gently on her shoulder. That's all I need to hear. The walk back to her car was different this time. It wasn't filled with the heavy weight of grief. There was a lightness to her step, a sense of possibility that hadn't been there before. Grace didn't know what the future held. She didn't know if she was ready for love, or if she ever would be. But tonight, for the first time since Michael's death, Grace allowed herself to believe in the idea of it. And for now, that was enough. The following weeks brought with them a quiet shift, a subtle change that Grace couldn't quite put her finger on. It wasn't dramatic, and it wasn't easy, but there was a new rhythm to her life. The guilt, though still present, didn't sting as fiercely as before. She began to find comfort in the small things again, the morning light streaming through her kitchen window, the laughter of her daughter Lily on the phone, and most unexpectedly, the quiet moments with Ethan. Grace had never imagined this kind of connection with anyone other than Michael. She had spent so many years believing that love was a once-in-a-lifetime thing, something to hold on to and never let go. But now with Ethan, she was beginning to understand that love wasn't finite. It wasn't something that would ever replace what she had with Michael. It was something that could exist alongside it, a new chapter in a book that wasn't done being written. It was Friday evening when Ethan texted her, asking if she wanted to join him for dinner. It had become their usual routine, a quiet meal together, sometimes at a local bistro, sometimes at one of their homes. But tonight, there was something different in the air. Grace had been feeling the weight of her indecision for days, the pull between her past and her future. What was she waiting for? She stared at the text message, her thumb hovering over the phone. She hadn't been expecting to feel this way. The more time she spent with Ethan, the clearer it became that there was something real between them. But there was also fear, the fear of moving forward, the fear of what it might mean to fully embrace a life without Michael. She hadn't yet told Ethan that she was still struggling with those feelings. She had kept them buried, thinking they would go away on their own. But tonight, she couldn't ignore them any longer. She replied to his message, "Dinner sounds great. But can we talk tonight? I think I need to say something." It wasn't easy to hit send. The words felt too heavy, too vulnerable, but it was a step toward something. She needed to be honest, not just with Ethan, but with herself. She couldn't keep carrying this burden of indecision. That evening, as Grace arrived at Ethan's apartment, she was greeted by the familiar warmth of his smile. He had already prepared dinner, a simple but comforting meal of pasta, salad, and a bottle of red wine. The cozy ambience of his apartment, the soft lighting and the scent of cooking food, felt like a sanctuary. "Hey," he said, opening the door wide and stepping aside to let her in. "I made your favorite." Grace smiled faintly, her nerves beginning to settle. "I'm starting to think you know me too well." "I'm not complaining," he teased, leading her to the table. "Besides, I've learned a lot from our dinners together. You don't just come for the food, do you?" Grace laughed softly, but her smile faded as she sat down. The words she had been carrying for so long were bubbling up, pressing at the edges of her consciousness. She couldn't put them off any longer. Ethan opened the wine, poured them each a glass, and set the bottle down. Then he sat across from her, his eyes soft, waiting for her to speak. It was clear he wasn't going to rush her. "I've been thinking a lot about us," Grace began, her voice a little shaky. She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "And about everything I'm feeling." Ethan nodded, leaning slightly forward. "I'm listening." Grace hesitated, glancing at her glass before meeting his gaze again. "The truth is, I've been scared. Scared of moving on, scared of letting myself feel something for you. I know we've been spending time together, and it's been good, but every time I start to think about the future, I get overwhelmed by this guilt." Ethan didn't speak immediately. He simply watched her, his expression open and patient. "I feel like I'm betraying Michael," she continued, her voice trembling. "I keep thinking that if I let myself love you, if I let myself fall for you, then it means I'm letting go of something I'm not ready to lose. And that's the hardest part for me. I loved him so much, Ethan. I don't know how to love again without feeling like I'm forgetting him." She paused, her breath catching in her throat. The tears were close, but she held them back, focusing on her words. Ethan's hand reached across the table, gently touching hers. "Grace," he said softly, "I would never want you to forget Michael. I can't even begin to imagine the love you shared, and I'm not here to replace that. What I want is for you to find peace, peace in your own heart. If that means honoring the past while moving forward, then I'll be right here with you." Grace looked down at their hands, feeling the warmth of his touch seep into her skin. "But what if I'm not ready for that? What if I never am?" Ethan gave her a small, understanding smile. "Then we'll take it one day at a time. I'm not going anywhere, Grace. There's no rush. You don't have to have it all figured out right now. Just take the next step when you're ready. And I'll be right here." A sense of calm washed over Grace at his words, a reassurance she hadn't realized she needed. The pressure to make a decision, to choose between her past and her future, had been suffocating her. But Ethan wasn't asking her to choose. He was simply asking for a chance to walk beside her as she navigated the unknown. She squeezed his hand, finally allowing herself to relax a little. "Thank you," she whispered, feeling a weight lift off her chest. "No need to thank me," Ethan said, his voice gentle. "I'm happy to be here. And I'll wait for however long it takes." Grace smiled, the first real smile she had felt in weeks. It wasn't just gratitude, it was hope. Hope that she could have both, the love she had lost and the love she could still find. As the evening unfolded, the two of them talked more, the conversation flowing freely as they shared stories, laughed at silly anecdotes, and enjoyed the simple joy of being together. Grace felt lighter than she had in months, not because the grief was gone, but because she finally allowed herself to believe that there was room for both the past and the future in her life. As she left Ethan's apartment later that night, she realized something. She wasn't running away from her past by considering a future with him. She was carrying it with her, learning to live with both. The journey wouldn't be easy, but she didn't have to walk it alone. Grace woke up early the next morning, the soft light of dawn slipping through the curtains, casting a warm glow across the bedroom. She lay in bed for a moment, still as the world around her stirred into life. For the first time in what felt like forever, her mind wasn't clouded with grief. It wasn't that the sadness was gone, no, that would always be with her, tucked away in the corners of her heart. But today, there was something else. Something new. Something that had been slowly growing inside her, nurtured by her time with Ethan, hope. As she sat up, the soft creak of the floorboards under her feet felt like a reminder that her world was shifting. It was a subtle change, But it was there. And it was real. The night before, she had shared a meal with Ethan, talked about everything and nothing, and for the first time in a long time, Grace had felt truly seen. He wasn't just a man offering her the comfort of a new relationship. He was a companion, a confidant, and though it scared her to admit it, he was beginning to feel like someone she could truly care for. She had spent so many months holding on to the past, unable to imagine a future beyond the grief of losing Michael. But with Ethan, she was starting to see that there was room for both, room for the love she had shared with Michael and room for something new, something she could choose for herself. Grace got dressed in a simple blouse and jeans, nothing fancy, but it felt good to put on something that wasn't loungewear. She made her way into the kitchen, the smell of coffee already filling the air. The lavender plant Ethan had brought was still on the counter, its small, vibrant purple blooms a stark contrast to the darkness that had once settled so heavily in her heart. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat down at the table, her thoughts drifting back to Ethan. He had given her the space to breathe, to heal, and for the first time since Michael's passing, Grace felt like she was beginning to move forward. It wasn't that she had forgotten Michael, how could she? He would always be a part of her. But she no longer felt chained to the past, drowning in the loss of what had been. She could carry his memory with her, honor it, and still allow herself to experience the possibility of new love. The phone buzzed on the table, interrupting her thoughts. She picked it up and saw a message from Ethan. "Good morning. I was thinking about you. If you're free this weekend, maybe we could go to the park? There's a new art exhibit I think you'd like. Let me know if you're up for it." Grace smiled at the message. It wasn't just an invitation, it was an offer to share something together, to continue building something new, even if it was just a small step. "I'd love to. Saturday afternoon works for me. Looking forward to it," she replied, pressing send before her thoughts could second-guess her decision. It felt right. It felt like she was moving forward in a way that didn't erase her past, but rather, built upon it. Saturday afternoon arrived, the sun shining brightly as Grace stepped out of her house. She had chosen a light dress, something that made her feel comfortable but also alive. The nerves that had once crippled her, the anxiety about moving on, had settled into a quiet excitement. She was nervous, but it wasn't a paralyzing fear. It was the kind of nervousness you felt before a first date, before something new and full of possibility. When Grace arrived at the park, Ethan was already there, waiting near the entrance, his hands shoved casually into the pockets of his jacket. He looked up as she approached, his smile warm and welcoming. "You look beautiful," he said, his voice soft but sincere. "Thank you," Grace replied, her cheeks warming slightly at the compliment. She still wasn't used to being seen this way, but she was beginning to like it, beginning to like the feeling of being present, of being fully herself. They walked together toward the exhibit, side by side, the conversation flowing easily as it always did between them. But this time, Grace felt the connection between them deeper, more certain. It wasn't just the shared moments or the laughter. It was the way they were building a life together, brick by brick, without rushing it, without forcing anything. The art exhibit was set up in a beautiful outdoor garden, the vibrant paintings contrasting with the greenery of the park. The colors were bold and alive, and as they walked through, Grace couldn't help but feel the parallels between the art and her own life. There was so much color, so much potential, waiting for her to embrace it, waiting for her to see the beauty that still existed. As they paused in front of a painting of a sunset over the ocean, Ethan turned to her. "What do you think?" he asked, his voice light, but there was something more in his eyes. Something deeper. Grace studied the painting, the rich hues of orange and red blending together in a way that made her heart ache. "It's beautiful. It makes me think about change. How something so bright and vivid can come from something as simple as the setting sun. How even endings can bring about new beginnings." Ethan smiled, his eyes locking with hers. "Exactly." They stood there for a moment, the sounds of the park fading into the background, the weight of their shared silence settling between them. It wasn't uncomfortable. In fact, it felt peaceful. Grace didn't need to say anything more. The truth of her feelings was there, between them, unspoken but understood. She was ready to take the next step, not because she had forgotten the past, but because she had learned to live with it. Later, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the sky turned to soft hues of pink and purple, Ethan walked Grace to her car. The evening had been perfect, the conversation easy, the connection undeniable. "Thank you for today," she said softly as she reached for the door handle. "No need to thank me," Ethan replied, his hand resting lightly on hers. "I'm just happy to be here with you." Grace's heart fluttered at his words, and for the first time, she didn't feel afraid. The past would always be a part of her, and that was okay. She could carry the love she had with Michael while still allowing room for new love, new possibilities. "I'm glad you're here too," Grace whispered, her voice steady with a quiet certainty. "And I think I'm finally ready to embrace tomorrow." Ethan smiled, leaning in just slightly, as if offering her the space to make her own decision. No pressure, no rush, just the promise of a future that they could walk into together. Grace looked up at him, her heart full of things she hadn't said but felt deeply. She leaned in and kissed him gently, a soft, slow kiss that spoke of beginnings, of healing, and of the promise of something beautiful ahead. When they pulled away, she didn't need any words to know that they were on the same page. This was just the beginning, the first step toward something real, something full of hope. As Grace drove home that evening, the stars shining above her, she felt lighter than she had in years. Tomorrow was waiting for her. And for the first time in a long time, she was ready to walk toward it.